This is the new TC Pride Podcast episode 129, on location at LUSH with Barry Karlenzig, Vice President of Programming for Pride Winnepeg. Twin Cities Pride Podcast here on location at LUSH in Minneapolis, and I am here with
Barry from Pride Winnepeg.
Barry, thanks so much for being here. So this is a very special, international edition of the TC Pride Podcast. So what can you tell people about the organization, first of all, and how it is that you are here in Minneapolis this weekend?
So I'm actually down here at Minneapolis this weekend for one of the other organizations that I'm part of. I'm one of two current reigning emperors for the Court of Winnipeg, down here for a court function, and then also working on some Pride things to see how both the Canadian Pride can help Twin Cities Pride and vice versa, as our prides are so close to each other.
That's right. So you were actually here a couple of years ago for Pride. Actually, you were here last year too. But we actually had you on the podcast for the first time a couple of years ago. You're here with some of your colleagues. And we talked a little bit about the differences kind of between, Winnipeg Pride and Twin Cities Pride, how we kind of steal/permanently borrow sort of our best ideas from each other. So people can go back and check out the episode about Winnipeg Pride and the TC Pride podcast. But aside from our organizations kind of just being besties sort of anyway, there's actually an official connection between the two cities.
Yeah, so the official connection, actually, when we met with our mayor in Winnipeg, we actually found out that many years ago, Twin Cities was issued a sister status with our city of Winnipeg by our standing mayor at the time.
And so last time we talked about the festivals, sort of some of the ways that the festival has evolved over the years. We didn't really get a chance to talk. You were there with some of your colleagues, right? So we didn't really get a chance to get into sort of each of your backgrounds and kind of what brought you to activism in the first place, and sort of what brought you to your involvement with Winnipeg Pride.
So what brought me to activism was actually about 8.5 years ago. I was volunteering at Geo's Club and Bar, which was a LGBT nonprofit bar in Winnipeg, and that bar closed down. And at the same year that I was working there, JD Francis, who was one of the programming team members at the time, had brought me on board to be a driver for a couple of the headliners. And then from there, I started as a driver, then I became the lead driver, executive assistant to the vice president of programming, logistics director, acting parade and rally director, to my role now as the vice president of programming. So it was just over that 7 years now with Pride, it's really started at the ground level and worked my way up. And everybody always asks me every year, why do you put the amount of hours you put in? Why do you do the amount of traveling? Why do you do what you do? And I say every year, the last 3 years at the festival or at the parade. Last year we had 2 elementary school GSAs that were there, which was absolutely amazing. And we had 2 junior high students come up to myself and our parade director, our new parade director now, and basically just give us a giant hug and said, thank you, we can be who we are today because of you. So when you have those types of things, you constantly want to keep giving more and more.
And so like I said, on the last episode, we talked about sort of some ways that the festival was different from ours. While we were sitting here talking before we started recording here, we talked about just sort of some of the fundamental ways that sort of the Pride movement, the LGBTQ movement, which we're going to get into as well in a second, in Canada, are different from our movement here in the United States, and maybe you wanted to touch on a couple of those as well.
So a couple things with our movement is we've started seeing at the festival level, we've started to see a movement on community groups wanting community space. So we've created community gardens this year. We've had a lot of groups approach us at looking for the next generation. So we have a 35,000 square foot kids area this year that'll have everything from a water park to bounce houses to live entertainment. We've also made sure that a socially excluded group as the French community, which is so close to the festival and so close in proximity, we've made sure that there's French programming this year. So there's not only a French host, there's French programming, there's French DJs, a little bit of everything. So really working on that, and then working tirelessly month after month with a lot of our community groups to see what we can do at the festival site to give them space so that they have a voice, or what we can do throughout the year to help give them that voice that they need. So this year, with Pride Winnipeg's theme being Pride of Color, we've made sure that we've kept the theme going so that we want to make sure that those groups that have felt underrepresented have a representation. We've also gone through things like our board where we've now ensured that there is a youth committee, there is a trans committee, there is a queer person of color committee, that we're getting the bylaws written and everything so that they can go to our AGM and be voted on by the membership so that they can become a proper part of the organization. And we've been working very closely with actually Red River College, one of our colleges there, to work on a Two-Spirit group where they've actually helped us write part of the programming, part of the ideas, and part of what that committee's 2-year, 5-year, 10-year goal would be. And really working closely with Two-Spirit people of Manitoba and QPOC Winnipeg, things like that. So really trying to make sure that every group gets that representation and gets their voice heard at the table with everybody else.
Yeah, so this is all obviously like leading towards the acronym that you guys use up there. But you also mentioned that you're working with the trans community to make sure that, you know, people from that community feel welcomed and included. That's another thing. So to me, it's so funny because like Canada, like, you're literally like a couple hours away, but like things can be so different. I mean, just so many of the words and sort of terminology that you guys use are so different. We were talking before we started recording here as well about like the trans community, how sort of the designation for the trans community is a little bit different in Winnipeg as well, or throughout Canada.
So on the Canadian aspect, we use the verbiage where it is anybody who is trans, they prefer trans identified, versus in the US I've noticed it's transgender. So they've taken the gender role out and made it trans identification. Same with with us having our acronym of, instead of LGBTQ, going into that GSRD, so gender, sexual, relationship, diverse. So making sure that in those 4 letters, everybody feels represented. This year we've had a couple groups come back to us, and as far as a couple of the other prides that have used the GSRD, and stated that they don't feel that they are represented in those letters. So now working with them to say, what can we do to either add a letter or change the acronym so that everybody feels excluded? Because right now the current alphabet, as we call it, for a better choice of words, it's that alphabet soup, because it's LGBTQ plus, or it's 2S LGBTQ. It's depending on where you go.
Did you say yours has like 26?
Somebody actually went online one time and actually looked around the world, and if you were to take the entire acronym, it's about 26 letters long. And that's not just on Canada, that's actually on a global scale if you were to use every letter that has been represented since the late 70s.
So let's back up a little bit and talk about kind of how, I mean, because that seems like it would be a process to get that sort of, if not sort of universally, sort of generally adopted, sort of by what we would call down here the LGBTQ plus community. How did that sort of all come about?
So it came about prior to me being on the board. So Jonathan, our past chair, was at a conference, at a Canada Pride conference, and there was a couple of Eastern Prides that had brought it up. We had learned that there was some research that had been done through the federal level to get that acronym created. And now we've slowly started launching it. We're starting to see it launch the rest across Canada, where it is that GSRD, but it is an uphill battle because you have other parts of the organization or other parts of the generational gap where they don't quite understand why. And they're just like, well, I've always stood in the LGBT. I've always been a gay, white, cis male. I've always represented that G. And trying to explain to them that times have changed, life has changed. We have to start looking at the broader picture and start making sure that everybody feels represented and everybody feels that they are a part of Pride and they are a part of the festival, the parade, the year-round, everything. They can be who they are. So now it's our turn in our mediums or larger size prides and in our positions of power to help educate everybody across Canada and even the world to start explaining this new acronym.
Yeah, so I mean, I've had some offline conversations with people just sort of in the community, and sort of that is kind of the main objection, I guess, I get to that, is that, you know, some of these communities have fought for decades to get that inclusion, and even maybe communities that have had that official letter in the acronym, like for example, like the bi community, right? So like they feel, not to like generalize, but I mean, I've talked to people who feel like, hey, well, we just got that letter, or the letter has been there, but we're just now starting to get the visibility based on that letter. What would you say to people, or like what has sort of the Winnipeg community sort of been saying to those people who feel like they've just been fighting for that visibility for so long, and now you quote unquote maybe want to take it away?
So myself being bi, I have gone through the same thing. I remember 2 years ago, our past chair at the time Jonathan had actually sat there and said in his speech at our Pride Parade was that, you know what, the L and the G have been very well represented across Canada and the US and the world for many years. Now it's time to give visibility and use our power for the other letters of the acronym. And same thing, being bi, when I saw the GSRD, I was like, okay, it's not the same. It's not the same thing, but it's taking away everybody being put into different silos. It allows everybody to be who they are and express themselves how they want to be. So by changing it to 4 acronyms or 4 letters versus 26 or the standard 7, it gives people anybody the ability to truly be who they are and represent without having to say, I fit in, I'm bi, so I must be the bi part of here. If I'm a bi person of color, am I bi or am I a queer person of color? Or if I'm bi, am I queer? If I'm a lesbian, am I lesbian or am I two-spirit? Things like that. So it was always, you'd have people fighting within their own communities to try and figure out where they sat in that whole letter acronym. Now they have the ability within 4 letters to really truly feel how they are and be able to express who they are.
Yeah, it feels like they're a lot they're a lot broader sort of categories for people. So like, I mean, I've talked to people who are like that, gender non-binary. They're like, well, like I don't necessarily consider myself like trans, but I'm sort of like lumped in like with the T. Oftentimes, the other thing that I love about the GSRD personally is the R. Like we don't really have an R unless you start adding like P's to the end of our acronym down here. So I think it's a great sort of movement. I'm really personally kind of hoping it picks up steam down here. The other thing that you kind of mentioned, so there was some work on the federal level, you said in Canada, to sort of make all this kind of happen a little bit. So that's something that we don't really have down here either. At Pride last year, I was walking around talking to people, and I think like the Canadian consulate or something was here. There's an actual like Pride Canada flag too, isn't there?
So there's actually a Canadian Pride flag as well that was unveiled down here actually this year, and we've used it for the last couple of years. But also when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau came into power, he created a specific role within his parliament, his upper parliament, where it is somebody who represents the LGBT community, and they are basically the voice of all of the queer people of Canada directly to the Prime Minister. So Randy Boissonnault, who is that role right now, he lives in Alberta, but meeting him on various different things, he's been that voice to the Prime Minister saying, we need to look at federal funding for some of these smaller prides. We need to look at, you look in Canada as a whole and you look at 75, 80 prides across Canada and how small Canada is. You look at Manitoba, we have 8 prides in Manitoba alone. That's huge. We have ours, which is the biggest one, and then we have smaller little prides, and prides keep popping up across Canada, which is great to see. But they need that funding, and it's our job as medium prides or larger prides to help get them that funding, but it has to start at the federal level. There has to be money there for us to be able to get the programming we need to ensure that we have accessibility, we have environmental impact, we have all those different things so that everybody can enjoy a festival that's free without having to charge for it.
Yeah, we are years away from that. So it is so cool to see that you guys are being pioneers in that area. I mean, we can only hope that we get that kind of support in the federal level for this community at some point. Speaking on the federal level, so like on the broader kind of Canadian level, so we're of course celebrating the 50th anniversary of Stonewall down here this year. You're celebrating a 50th something else up there.
Correct. So we're celebrating the 50th Partial Decriminalization Act that went around by, at that time, our current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, his father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, put in legislative changes where people no longer could be arrested or anything based on their sexual preferences. So it's a partial decriminalization. It took a couple other years after this to go that far to get to where we are now, but it is recognizing that 50 years ago that pioneer first started and that first get it to where we are now 50 years later. So everything is decriminalized now. It was just 50 years ago, it wasn't just everything went from being legal or illegal to legal. So there was a partial decriminalization. It took about 5 to 10 years to get it so that it was full legalization. So it was just, we wanted to make sure to recognize that it wasn't a full decriminalization 50 years ago. It was only partial. There were other steps that had to be taken on various groups. There was various apologies that had to be done, and there was various people sitting in prison because of their choice. So our Prime Minister this past year did a formal apology to all of the queer people of Canada and apologized for what had happened 50 years plus ago. So it's just, we want to make sure to recognize that it wasn't a full decriminalization, it was a partial decriminalization. It did take more years to get that to where it is now across Canada as a whole, but it was the stepping stone to where we are now.
And I understand Saskatoon, they hosted a huge sort of international conference this year.
Yeah, Saskatoon this past year hosted the 2018 AGM and World Conference representing part of Interpride, which is the association of all the prides around the world. So we had the luxury of working on various ideas with Twin Cities Pride and different prides across Canada and the world, and have an amazing 3-day conference, different workshops, and really get to meet and share ideas and cross collaborations. And then since then, I'm actually very happy to announce that Pride Winnipeg will be formally bidding on this same conference to host in 2021. So we will be actually going out to Greece this year to pitch the bid October of this year, and hopefully winning the bid for 2021.
And it probably can't hurt that that Pride Winnipeg is going to be hosting Canada Pride. What, this year? Next year?
So Pride Winnipeg will actually, for 2020, be hosting Canada Pride. And Fierté Montreal Pride is actually, while we're out in Greece bidding on the Interpride conference, they're actually going to be bidding for World Pride 2023. So definitely bringing a lot of focus to Canada as a whole.
So we don't have like a USA Pride here. How does this whole Canada Pride thing work?
So from my understanding of it, Fierté Canada Pride started with the Fierté Canada Pride Board. So there is a Pride Board that represents all the prides across Canada. And we're a member of Interpride, which then represents all the prides across the world. So in the US, there's different regions. So there's Region 5, Region 6, different regions. Twin Cities is part of that region. But it started in its fruition of we needed to do something on a Canada level to promote Canadian equality, but also to promote Canada as a whole. So we started with Canada Pride. 2017 marked the first one, which was in Fierté Montreal. And now Winnipeg will be hosting it in 2020, and then hopefully we'll see what happens, who the next one is that bids for the next one.
And so what were some things that came out of that international conference in Saskatoon?
So some of the things that came out of it was, for us in Canada, we went through an accessibility area where we started explaining accessibility all across Canada and how it works on the Canadian prides. There was a fundraising one that was put on by the U.S. Department as well as the Canadian government, and to go through different fundraising, and then just hearing different ideas, looking at the global scale where things like PrEP, which is now free in a couple provinces in Canada and a couple of US states, it's more readily available in Europe because those European prides and those European cities and organizations have more funding and more buy-in from their province or their township or things like that, where there's more money and more funding available to be able to do cross-year programming, cross-year festivals, and really work for those different organizations. We're
also chatting here, as cool as you guys are in Canada, and as much progress as you've made, you still see yourselves as way behind Europe.
Yeah, so looking at, being at the Saskatoon Interpride and just hearing different things in Europe where you just hear how things in Europe is so different, and when it came to the LGBT community or the GSRD community, just hearing how different it is overseas to here. Yes, we're on the pioneer front compared to the US, no offense, but looking at Europe, like, we still have things to learn. And the nice thing of being part of a member of Interpride and going to these conferences year round is we get the ability to really sit down and work with each individual prides and build ideas that work for not just us, but everybody at a global scale, and be that voice at a global power level.
Really, at the end of the day, we all kind of are working together. You said it's really like a big family sort of working together, right?
Yeah, it's basically, when you go to these conferences, it's almost like a family reunion. You're running into people you've seen through different prides, different organizations over the years, and you're really going through to see different ideas. What works here might not work there. What works in Toronto, Ontario might not necessarily work in Winnipeg, but
even within Canada,
it might not work there, but it might work down here, and vice versa. There might be something from Twin Cities, ideas that we've taken over the years, that
permanently borrowed,
that would work really well in Winnipeg, and things like that, where it's nice to see those ideas. And all being non-for-profits, depending on where your prides are, a lot of the prides even in Canada are all volunteers. Pride Winnipeg is 100% volunteer based. So all of our stuff is volunteer, all of our travel is volunteer, everything. A couple of the bigger prides may have an executive director or some paid staff, but a lot of the prides in Canada and a lot of the smaller prides even in the US are still all 100% volunteer based. So there's a ton of volunteer hours, and there's a ton of just volunteering to get things to where they are so that everybody can enjoy a successful festival and a parade, everything else throughout the year.
And on that federal level too, you were talking about how there's been a lot of progress, so that the military, like the Canadian military, recently joined in the Winnipeg parade.
Yeah, so last year I was the acting parade and rally director before I gained my role now as the vice president of programming. And in that role, we actually had the military in our parade for the first time ever. So the military showed up on a 53-foot flat deck trailer with a live military band. And
because if you're going to do it, right?
Yeah, exactly. If you're going to do it, go big, go home. And they made sure that the highest ranking officers, there was a brigadier general, there was lieutenant colonels, they made sure that every highest ranking official that was stationed in Manitoba was there, and they made sure to make a point, and they spoke to myself and other individuals within the community and said, we needed to be here. This is a huge commitment to us because we need to make sure that everybody in Canada understands we're there fighting for rights for everybody no matter what. We're there protecting everybody no matter what.
And speaking of all volunteer organizations, I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. So you mentioned at the beginning of the episode here that you're heavily involved with the Imperial Court, which has a presence here in the Twin Cities as well. They're an all-volunteer organization. They've been at it for, I think they said they've been at it for like 20-something years, right? So maybe you can just tell folks a little bit about that, have an opportunity to just tell people a little bit about the Imperial Court and kind of how you're involved with them, sort of a little deeper level here.
So sitting not only on our Pride board, I'm also one of 2 current reigning Regent Emperors for Winnipeg and all of Manitoba on the International Court system. So a chapter of the International Court that represents courts from all across Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. One of our sister courts is actually the Court of Minnesota, and they're in their 27th year. So myself and Peter, as current emperors, are actually also have the honor title of being half emperors of Minnesota. And Tanya, who is currently the Regent Empress here, is also a half empress of Winnipeg. So we try to make sure that everybody is looked after, but it's sitting on that volunteer level. When you volunteer in this community, you're not just volunteering on one organization. You'll end up joining another one and another one and another one. In the 10 years I've been out, I've joined 5 or 6 different organizations. And you constantly just want to give back to that community, because the way I've always looked at it is I wouldn't be where I am today and have the power I have and the voice I have without those other community groups or those forefathers before us that really gave me the voice to be where I am. Having the luxury of Pride to being in its 32nd year, 2 years ago, having the 30th anniversary and actually meeting individuals who had walked in the first Pride parade down there, and actually meeting a gentleman, Mr. Toom, who had actually started the very first Gay Straight Alliance in the University of Winnipeg back in the 70s. He was 94 years old and showed up at our Pride parade, and he was like, I'd love to speak. We said, we would love to have you. You're 94. You are one of the reasons why we can be who we are today. And it's just, I see my 5.5-year-old nephew sitting at home. And I sit there, now he's 6, and I'm like, every year he gets older and older, and I'm like, I do this so that when he gets older, no matter what he does, he will be who he wants to be and have any ability to do whatever he wants in Winnipeg.
We also wanted to give you guys a chance to talk about the festival, a little shameless plug for the festival this year, and talk about your new app. I think you mentioned your app briefly, all the cool things happening at Pride Winnipeg, the festival itself this year.
So to bring up the app, we're one of 3 prides in Canada that have actually launched a formal Pride app. So it allows all the community groups who have entered in to have their programming listed not only in our Pride Guide but on our website, to now have it on the app. So this year there's over 50 community events going on during our 10 days of Pride that'll actually be mentioned during the app, so someone can go through the app and look day by day and have an idea of what other event they want to go to. It also looks through our headliners, and it helps on the accessibility front. So some of our key pillars being accessibility and sustainability, we've had to print less Pride Guides. So we help on the sustainability. On the accessibility side, we now have an app so people can enlarge the screen or do caption audio, things like that. Things that we've also brought on this year at our festival site as a whole is we've brought in a huge kids area that'll have kids programming. So it'll have, it's the kid zone. So it'll have things like bobcats or skid steers that kids can take their pictures in. There'll be kids programming. There'll be Read by Queens. There'll be Home Depot will actually be doing build-a-shops there, so birdhouses, things like that. Our Manitoba Teacher Society will be there doing face painting. Our local sports team, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, will actually be there with bounce castles and things like that, and really introducing that. And then we're introducing a community garden this year as well, or a community area that will house the Two-Spirit Powwow and some community programming throughout Pride Weekend as well.
I also feel like we have to shout out the people behind the app quick, because, you know, there's only 3 of them in all of Canada, so I imagine this isn't an easy task.
So it's a company called Greencopter. They're based out of Eastern Canada, but it's an app that we work very closely with. So a plug to Elisa, who's our marketing director. She spent countless hours and hours and hours getting it ready for not only for the Android side, but also for iPhone. And really 80% of the designing in that app was her custom creating it. So yes, there's the app with the different pages and things like that, but putting in 50 plus community events, putting in all the pictures and all that kind of stuff. As a volunteer organization, we're a group of 20 year round. And every single individual this year has done countless hours to be where we are now, to be able to looking at Canada Pride next year and bidding for a world conference in 2021. We wouldn't be where we are now without the volunteers we have.
Well, again, I want to thank you so much for being here. This is kind of a total last minute thing. So if this interview sounds a little disjointed and kind of last minute, it totally was. So I want to thank you again for your time. Really appreciate you being here. So we'll kind of wrap here with sort of like the what, when, where info about the festival. Like I said, Winnipeg is just like 6 hours away if you drive straight through, right? So all the information about the festival, where can people find out about everything that's going on? 10 days of the festival here coming up.
So any information to be found on our 10 days, you can either download the app both on Android and iPhone, and you just look for Pride Winnipeg app. You can go onto our website, pridewinnipeg.com. You can see us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and our festival kicks off on May the 24th, and our actual 2-day festival, so our 10 Days of Pride is May 24th. Our 2-day festival starts June 1st and June 2nd with our Pride Parade going back down the historic Portage Avenue and marching part of the original route that was done 32 years ago.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, man. And I'm sure we'll talk to you again soon. Thanks for listening to the TC Pride podcast, and we'll see you next time.
Perfect. Thank you.
The TC Pride podcast is a production of the nonprofit podcast community and Twin Cities Pride. Subscribe now on iTunes, on Android, or by email at tcpridepodcast.org. Because we're in this together. NonPod turns your email newsletter, blog, or video content into a more powerful, more personal, more intimate, on-demand listening experience. Your podcast, your story, your voice, simplified, amplified. Learn more now at nonpod.com.